The air was dry and still when the first shovel struck the earth. What began as routine landscaping turned into a gruesome discovery that paralyzed an entire town. In the soft soil of a quiet suburban backyard, authorities uncovered something horrifying. 17 decaying, severed left hands, each buried with precision, each telling a silent story of violence and intent. But whose hands were they and why only the left? The midday sun beat down on the quiet neighborhood of Elk Grove as landscapers began tearing up the Jenkins backyard. What was supposed to be a minor renovation, removing an old cracked patio to make room for a new garden, quickly became something far more sinister. The shovel made a dull thud against something that wasn't stone or root. At first, the workers thought it was trash, maybe an old glove or decaying fabric. But as one of them knelt down to clear the dirt, he froze. Fingers. Human fingers. Pale, decomposing, curled unnaturally as though still clenching onto something in death. Within the hour, the police were on site. The area was cordoned off, the Jenkins family sent away for questioning, and the news began to trickle out, first as whispers among neighbors, then as headlines that would shake the town to its core. Forensic teams began digging carefully, layer by layer. And then they found another hand. Then another. Each buried separately, each appearing to be intentionally placed. 17 in total. All left hands. No bodies. No right hands. Just a grotesque collection of severed limbs, each in its own shallow grave, some wrapped in cloth, others buried bare. The hands varied in size and age. Some clearly belonged to adults, others perhaps to teens. Some were weathered and rotting, others disturbingly fresh. The pattern was chilling. One investigator was overheard saying it looked ritualistic, but that only fueled public paranoia. Speculation exploded. Was this the dumping ground of a serial killer? A cult? A deranged collector? The discovery paralyzed Elk Grove. A place known for block parties and Sunday BBQs was now overrun by forensic vans, floodlights, and news choppers hovering overhead. People who'd once walked their dogs or let their children play in open yards now locked their doors tight, drew their curtains, and watched nervously as investigators came and went, carrying evidence bags and shaking their heads grimly. The Jenkins family, understandably, was horrified. They'd only lived in the house for 8 months, having bought it at a reduced price from a foreclosure auction. Like many buyers, they hadn't asked too many questions. They wanted a quiet life, and the small house on the edge of town seemed perfect. But now, reporters were practically camped on their lawn, and social media was ablaze with theories. Some said the family knew more than they let on. Others suspected the previous owner, whose name quickly resurfaced from dusty property records. As the forensic team dug deeper, the spacing and placement of the hands began to raise more questions. Each one had been buried roughly 3 feet apart, spaced with unsettling precision, like markers on a twisted grid. The soil in that area had been deliberately softened and turned at some point, suggesting the act wasn't rushed. Whoever had done this had taken their time. It wasn't a panic burial. It was organized, even calm. The hands themselves became the most critical pieces of evidence. Forensic analysis began immediately. Partial fingerprints were recovered from 2 of the more intact hands. DNA swabs were sent to labs in-state and across the country, cross-referenced with missing persons databases. Within 72 hours, 2 matches came back, both belonging to women who had gone missing within a 50-mile radius of Elk Grove in the last decade. Neither case had been solved. Both victims had vanished without a trace, and until now their files had sat cold in the county archive. This new connection gave investigators their first real lead. And it confirmed everyone's worst fear. These hands weren't symbolic. They weren't replicas. They belonged to real people, and whoever had taken them had likely done far worse. The question now shifted from who buried them to how many more victims might there be? The media had a field day. National networks began running specials on the hand collector of Elk Grove. Commentators debated whether the hands were trophies or warnings. Online forums erupted with wild theories. Some said the hands were offerings, others claimed they were punishments. Some even speculated about organ trafficking rings, though no medical signs supported that. Law enforcement, trying to maintain control of the narrative, held a brief press conference. They confirmed the count, 17 hands, all severed at the wrist, no signs of burial tools found. They declined to name any suspects. One chilling detail leaked from an anonymous source made it onto a late-night crime podcast. Each of the hands had its fingernails clipped. Some were trimmed neatly, others jagged and rushed, but all of them had been altered post-mortem. This led to new speculation. Was the killer trying to remove evidence? Or was it part of some macabre routine? Meanwhile, the Jenkins family relocated temporarily under police suggestion. Despite having no known link to the case, they were hounded by paparazzi and online sleuths digging through their past. The husband, an IT consultant, had no criminal record. The wife, a teacher's assistant, was visibly shaken during her last public appearance. But the real pressure was on law enforcement. 17 left hands, and not a single right. That detail lingered in the minds of investigators and terrified residents alike. It didn't make sense. Not unless the act was deeply intentional. Not unless this was a message and the person who buried them believed the left hand meant something. Something symbolic. Something personal. As night fell on the neighborhood once again, police floodlights lit up the backyard where the secrets had lain hidden for years. But the truth was only just beginning to surface. The quiet charm of the Jenkins house had always masked something peculiar, but no one had thought to look closely until the backyard gave up its secret. Now, with 17 severed left hands unearthed, investigators turned their attention to the past. Who had lived on this property before and what might they have hidden beneath the soil? Property records pointed to a name that hadn't been spoken in years: Thomas Albright. He had owned the house for nearly 25 years before defaulting on the mortgage and vanishing almost overnight. There were no forwarding addresses, no family contacts, and no explanations. Just a hollow, abandoned property left behind with its dark history sealed underground. Neighbors recalled him as quiet but odd. He rarely attended community events, never spoke more than a few words, and was mostly seen at night. Delivery trucks would come and go in the late hours, boxes unmarked, always brought through the back door. A few local kids had whispered that his house was haunted. One boy even claimed to have seen Thomas digging in the yard one moonless night, but his parents dismissed it as childish imagination. Now that memory felt far more sinister. Detectives tracked down old police records hoping for any clues. One report from 2006 noted a noise complaint, screams heard by a neighbor in the middle of the night. Officers had responded, but Thomas calmly explained that he was watching a horror film at high volume. With no probable cause, the officers left, and the report was buried among thousands of others. Another file surfaced from a decade earlier, missing person reports involving 2 young women who were last seen hitchhiking near the interstate, just a few miles from the neighborhood. At the time, no one linked them to the area, and there was no known connection to Thomas. But now, investigators began cross-referencing those cold cases with the limited forensic data retrieved from the hands. One woman, Vanessa Griggs, had been reported missing by her sister in 1998. At the time, she was dismissed as a runaway, another name lost in a system that failed so many. But when her DNA matched one of the left hands, the narrative shifted. Vanessa hadn't run away, she'd been taken. And someone had kept part of her hidden under a suburban yard for over 2 decades. As police continued digging through records, the house revealed more of its secrets. The basement, long sealed by the new owners due to mold and rot, was reopened by forensic teams. There, beneath the mildew-stained walls, they found something chilling. Hooks mounted into the concrete, deep scratches in the floor, and the faintest remnants of what looked like dried blood along the baseboards. Whatever had happened there hadn't been an accident. It had been controlled. Deliberate. Designed for pain. A former postal worker who had delivered in the area remembered Thomas vividly. He always refused to come to the door, instead requiring packages to be left on a bench near the gate. But once, after a heavy storm, the carrier was forced to knock. When Thomas opened the door, the carrier saw something he never forgot. The hallway behind him was covered with plastic tarps. At the time, he assumed it was renovations. Now, that image felt like a window into something far more disturbing. Investigators unearthed another potential clue. Thomas had once worked at a local medical supply warehouse. He had access to surgical gloves, scalpels, preservatives, and industrial-grade plastic. He had been fired abruptly in 2011 after several complaints of inappropriate behavior and missing inventory. No charges were filed. The company didn't want trouble, and Thomas simply disappeared from their records after that. But it placed him in direct contact with the tools and materials necessary to preserve and hide human remains for years. A breakthrough came when police searched through nearby storage unit facilities. Using Thomas's last known details, they traced a rental under an alias, E. Tanner. Inside the small, dust-covered unit, they found boxes of old notebooks, VHS tapes, and a rusted toolbox stained with something dark. The tapes were degraded, but some still played. The footage was grainy and silent, filmed from a fixed angle in what looked like the very same basement. Though the images were hard to watch, they showed what investigators feared most. People tied up, struggling, their faces twisted in fear. Each tape was labeled with only a date. The journals were more disturbing. Written in obsessive detail, they chronicled every abduction, every method, every disposal. The entries described how the left hand was chosen deliberately, seen by Thomas as a symbol of weakness, of punishment. He believed the left hand represented the shadow self, a flawed part of humanity he sought to remove. Each victim was corrected through ritualized violence, then catalogued and discarded. According to the journal, there were more than 17 victims. Some were burned, others dissolved in chemicals, and only a select few were chosen to have their hands buried. But why the backyard? Why not a remote field, a river, or a landfill? The journal answered that too. Thomas believed that the soil around his home was sacred, a place where pain could be returned to the earth and kept quiet. They whisper to me, one entry read. They never scream here. They're silent like they should be. It became evident that the entire property was a burial ground of trauma, one cultivated over years in total secrecy. The town of Elk Grove, once proud of its safety, was forced to confront the truth that a monster had lived among them, smiling faintly at the grocery store, waving politely to children on Halloween, all the while hiding atrocities mere feet below their feet. And yet, Thomas Albright had vanished. His last confirmed sighting was nearly 6 years ago, boarding a bus headed toward the mountains. Since then, nothing. No sightings. No credit card activity. No cell phone signals. Just darkness. As the story broke across national outlets and law enforcement widened their net, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The man responsible for 17 severed left hands had once lived next door, and he might still be out there. The grotesque nature of the crime alone was enough to paralyze the town with fear, but what truly tormented investigators was the question of why. 17 left hands, each buried with care, some wrapped like keepsakes, others left exposed to the soil. No right hands. No full bodies. This wasn't just disposal. It was ritual. A signature. A message. Something deliberate. Something coded. With every new piece of evidence unearthed, it became clearer that the motive wasn't simple bloodlust. It was methodical, obsessive, and deeply personal. Experts were brought in, criminologists, forensic psychologists, cult behavior analysts, each offering their theories. One pointed out that the severing of the left hand had long been used symbolically in both religious and occult practices. In ancient texts, the left hand was often associated with betrayal, sin, or weakness. In some circles, cutting off a left hand was considered punishment for theft or disobedience. But this case went deeper. There were no known cults operating in the area. No signs of group activity. Everything pointed to a single mind, working alone, consumed by an ideology of control and punishment. When investigators reviewed Thomas Albright's journals found in the storage unit, the pages revealed a disturbed philosophy that blurred the lines between delusion and design. He wrote obsessively about the left path and purging imbalance. Each victim he believed had failed society in some invisible way, liars, manipulators, predators. People he claimed no one would truly miss. He saw himself as a purifier, a judge in secret. He would watch his victims for weeks, sometimes months, documenting their routines, their relationships, even their moral flaws, real or imagined. Then he would strike. The abduction was planned like a military operation. The act itself was, in his words, a cleansing. His journals described the removal of the left hand not as punishment but as liberation. He believed the left hand held the weight of guilt, and that by removing it he was freeing his victims from their darkness. The severing was almost ceremonial. In one entry he wrote, "Only the left. Always the left. That's where it lives. That's where it breathes." But perhaps the most disturbing detail came from a final section of one of the notebooks, ripped and smeared with dirt as if hastily written. There he referenced a belief in the 17th. Investigators initially assumed it was the final hand they had found, but deeper examination suggested otherwise. According to his writings, the number 17 had special significance. He believed it was the balance point. Anything more would cause disorder, anything less would be incomplete. 17 was his perfection. His cycle. Which led to a horrifying realization. If 17 hands had been buried, then he considered this particular series complete. It wasn't a random number. It was intentional. Which meant he may have done it before. Or could do it again. The coded journal also contained a series of strange diagrams, circular symbols, spiral patterns, and hand-drawn maps with cryptic labels. One matched the grid layout of the backyard, confirming the methodical burial pattern. Another map, however, pointed to a remote woodland area nearly 40 miles from town. Search teams were dispatched immediately. What they found there was less conclusive but just as haunting. A rusted metal chair bolted to a rock slab, surrounding trees stripped of bark in square patterns and bones, animal mostly, but one fragment, a piece of a human jawbone, was unmistakable. The psychology team confirmed what investigators already feared. This was not impulsive behavior. It wasn't driven by rage or desperation. This was the work of a man who believed in a cause, one entirely invented but deeply rooted in his identity. His killings weren't just murders. They were rituals designed to fulfill an inner doctrine that only he understood. A handwriting analyst found disturbing consistency in his journal entries, precise strokes, even when describing acts of extreme violence. This cold clarity suggested a lack of emotional turmoil. He didn't feel conflict over what he did. He felt justified, empowered, in control. One final artifact shifted the investigation's emotional tone entirely: a photograph buried in one of the storage boxes. It showed a young woman tied at the wrists, terrified, gagged, her left sleeve rolled up. On the back was written, "I only needed her left." It wasn't just horror, it was a statement of intent. The image was timestamped 6 months after Thomas had supposedly left town. This implied one terrifying thing: the cycle hadn't ended when he abandoned the house. It had simply moved. The backyard was not the full graveyard. It was just one chapter. One message. What message was he sending? That justice, in his twisted mind, could be delivered by taking something as small and symbolic as a hand. That control over someone's guilt or imagined guilt could be exacted through silence and burial. That even in a place as mundane and peaceful as Elk Grove, darkness could live beneath the roses and the fences and the garden gnomes. And the most unsettling truth of all? The man responsible had never been caught. He had left a trail, yes, a terrifying one, but no confirmed sightings. No fingerprints beyond the scene. No bodies to tie him definitively to his victims. Just hands. Just journals. Just whispers in the dirt. To some, that was the worst part, not the murders themselves but what they meant. The possibility that Thomas Albright had left behind a philosophy, a blueprint for others just like him. That someone else could pick up where he left off. That the next 17 might already be chosen.